This list has me feeling a little bit exposed. Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to my top 10 books, nonfiction list for the year 2023. As I kind of joked around in the intro, one of the things that occurred to me in looking and making my list is that I kind of am exposing the areas of interest in which I read this year, or in general, the kind of areas of interest I have in terms of nonfiction. I wonder if, I suspect that nonfiction always kind of gives away areas of interest more so than fiction reading does. And so you're going to be able to tell right away some of the things that I'm interested in as topics in reading and nonfiction. You're also going to be able to tell right away that a lot of my nonfiction reading leans towards history. So I have 10 books. I've ranked them 10 to 1, with one being, my favorite nonfiction read of the year. And I have 2 honorable mentions. So I'm just going to start with the honorable mentions first. So my first honorable mention is I'm Afraid of Men by Vivek Shraya. Shraya is an entertainer and a writer, and she is a trans person. And this book, I'm Afraid of Men, essentially details her experiences and her feelings. As a young person, she was living the life of a boy or a man and never masculine enough to avoid violence from men. And then as a trans person, how she sometimes is made aware that she's not representing completely femininely to lots of people, and this then makes her a target, and thus the title I'm Afraid of Men. This is a really powerfully emotional kind of look at the trans experience in Canada. I believe she's a Canadian, but around the world, and I thought it was really, really good. The second honorable mention I have is Everybody Was So Young by Vail. This is a book that I threatened to read as part of Nonfiction November for years, since I've had my channel, and I finally did it. So this is a book about the Murphys, the Gerald and Sarah Murphy, who were a part of the lost generation, a part of the expatriate community from the United States who traveled to Europe in the 20s and in the 30s and lived there. And they were friends with, all the writers and a lot of the artists. Picasso was a friend of theirs. They were friends with Hemingway and Fitzgerald, and, Zelda and Scott spent time with them. And so that was kind of the hook that drew me to the story. And I thought this book was really well done. It is not just about all the things the Murphys knew about these other more famous people. It's also about their lives and their relationship and them as people and how they developed over time, and a lot of really tragic and bitter events that happened during their life as well. And I thought it was really well done. So then to get to my top 10 list of books, the 10 books that I thought were best, and nonfiction books that I thought were best that I read this year. The first of those is Never Caught by Erica Armstrong Dunbar. This is the story of Ona Judge, one of George Washington's enslaved people who escaped. Washington, when he was elected president, moved to Philadelphia to be president of the United States. And the thing about Philadelphia was that they had a rule against slavery. That enslaved people who were in Philadelphia were in fact free, but there was an exception. If they stayed in Philadelphia for more than, I think, like 6 weeks at a time, then they would be freed. Well, this meant that Washington, when he took the enslaved people that made up his household staff to Philadelphia, had to kind of rotate them between Mount Vernon and Philadelphia, or they would become free. It also meant that Washington's enslaved people who went with him to Philadelphia were aware that freedom was really close by. And Ona Judge decides to try to take advantage of that and makes contact with a group of free African-American people in Philadelphia who are able to help her get away. And then she essentially lives life on the run. And Washington definitely pursued her, put advertisements in the paper. He was frustrated, angry when she left. Another one of Washington's enslaved people, one of his valuable slaves, is Cook, also is going to escape around the same time period. And it's really a story of Ona Judge and how kind of this pursuit of slavery by, Washington, who many people in the United States kind of view as the most benign of all the slave-owning founding fathers. He certainly wasn't. This kind of exposes him as being someone who was really determined to get what he considered his property back. It's a really good book, and it's a really kind of, I think, powerful story about how Ona Judge is able to escape and go on with her life. At number 9 on my list, I have Trans Like Me by C.N. Lester. C.N. Lester identifies as genderqueer. I think they might also consider themselves to be gender fluid. So I'm going to refer to them as they because I believe that is correct. This book, Trans Like Me, was such a great book for me as a cis person to read because I feel like it addressed a lot of issues, a lot of questions that I have always had about the trans experience, about trans people, about gender fluid people. And it addressed a lot of those issues. And it kind of opened my eyes to a real reality that I had not been able to experience personally. And so for that reason, I thought the book was incredibly powerful. It's full of personal stories. It's full of kind of general stories that Lester was able to accumulate. It's got actual scientific information in it. It really is a good book. And I hate to say, if I were to say that I thought Lester wrote the book for cis people, so that we could understand, that would be complete mischaracterization. Lester wrote the book for trans people, particularly for young trans people, to let them know they weren't alone, that there was a way forward, that it might be difficult, but it might also, for them, if they chose it, to transition, be worthwhile. Lester is also a singer, performer, and writer. I believe classical singer and a writer of not pop songs, but I guess what I would call modern songs. Anyway, a really good book, and a book I intend to reread this year. At number 8, I have a book that I've reviewed on my channel relatively recently. That is The Lumumba Plot by Stuart A. Reid. This is a story about essentially the plot to remove Patrice Lumumba from the leadership of the Congo. The Congo gained its independence from Belgium in the early 1960s, and the first elected president, I'm going to call him president, I can't remember the actual title, perhaps prime minister, of the independent Congo was Patrice Lumumba. And this tells Lumumba's story, kind of warts and all, about how Lumumba came to be in that position. And then it talks about how, Lumumba's actions were interpreted by the United States and other nations as being pro-communist and hostile, and how he made some mistakes, and how eventually that led to the United States adopting policy to get rid of Lumumba and essentially to get rid of Lumumba in the most literal way possible, which ends up being quite horrifying. And then also how this action that the United States took in the Congo kind of sets the stage, becomes a model the United States will follow, to the detriment of the United States, but more importantly, the detriment of the nations in which we interfered for a long period of time. It's kind of that beginning of a kind of American colonialism that isn't really necessarily about us occupying territory, taking over territory, but about us controlling governments by controlling money and military matters. I thought the book was really good. In places it reads like a spy story. Number 7, I have 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup. This is literally what's referred to as a slave narrative. Northup was himself enslaved incredibly unjustly. He was essentially kidnapped in Washington, D.C., sold into slavery in Louisiana, and I mean way back in the woods of Louisiana, where he witnessed all the indignities, all the hardships of an enslaved person, and miraculously, eventually was able to get legal help from the North, proving that he was not, in fact, the person that the slave catcher told him into slavery in Louisiana said he was. That he was, in fact, a free man, which was true. And eventually he's able to return to his family. This is an incredibly important work. And I would say, if you really want to get some insights into the way slavery worked in the United States, particularly kind of in the years after the American Revolution, that Northup's book is incredibly important to understanding that. And you will find when you read it, and if you read other books about slavery in the United States of America, you will find that Northup's book informs a lot of our knowledge about how the system of slavery worked in terms of treatment of slaves, in terms of the way slaves were bought and sold, in terms of the way slaves were kept, in terms of food, etc. It's just a really, really good book and really important. At number 6, I have Empire of Pain by Patrick Radden Keefe. I read this book as an audiobook in November as a part of Nonfiction November, and I liked it. I thought it was really important I will say that there were times at which there were elements in the book that I didn't think were particularly important to the story, but the author did, and they were included. And certainly it was the kind of book which provoked a reaction in me. It made me angry at the Sackler family and their ability to escape justice in lots of ways, for essentially by promoting opioids and OxyContin, addicting and killing thousands of Americans, and profiting from that. Really powerful book in that way. I know I kind of gave the impression when I first reviewed it, talked about that maybe I didn't like it, but I do think it was an excellent book. Number 5 on my list, I have As We've Always Done by Leanne Betasamosake Simpson, who you may know was the author of one of my favorite books from 2 years ago, which was Newpoming, which is a great, incredibly inventive kind of work of fiction. I just thought it was excellent. This book was just, I don't know why, but this book really piqued my interest. One of my areas of reading is reading about Indigenous Americans. Now, Simpson lives in Canada, but Indigenous Americans, north or south of that border between the United States and Canada, and the ways in which European colonizer societies had treated them, deprived them of everything, and the ways in which that they are trying to survive and recover. And what Simpson argues here is that the way to survive and recover is to thrive by going back to traditional indigenous ways, and that includes being tied to the land, and that connection to the land itself has to be a part of this resistance. At the same time, she makes it clear that she doesn't believe that Indigenous Americans should be trying to convince white America to leave them alone or let them be, or to assimilate and to find acceptance in these kind of white colonial government structures, but instead to resist as Indigenous peoples have always done. I thought it was great. Definitely not a book written with me in mind, but a book from which I learned a tremendous amount. At number 4 on my list, I have How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith. I think this book might have won the BookTube Prize for nonfiction a couple of years ago. And like is true oftentimes the books that get a lot of hype or promotion on BookTube, for whatever reason, I decided not to read it until this year. And I read it and I really thought it was great. Clint Smith is a journalist, and he is going to travel around to important sites in the history of slavery in the United States, from plantations, including Monticello, and then one in Louisiana. He goes to the Angola prison. He travels to Gorée Island in Senegal, from which many African people were sold into slavery there, and then forced onto ships for the Americas. And it's a really, really good book, a really, really good look at, kind of the reality of slavery again in the United States. And I thought it was a really, really powerful book. I think I've said really like 110 times. Number 3 on my list is a book that I really just finished just this month, and that's The Wager by David Grann, I believe is his name. David Grann is probably right now most famous for being the author of The Killers of the Flower Moon, I believe, which was made into a movie recently. In this book, Grann is going to be talking about the English ship, the British ship, Her Majesty's ship, The Wager, which was a part of a squadron of ships that England, Great Britain, dispatched to try to attack Spanish silver ships and trade ships in the Pacific. And The Wager was one of, I believe, 5 ships, and they sail down the coast of South America, and they attempt to make the passage around Cape Horn, and they run into disaster. And The Wager, it becomes a shipwreck, and many of her men survive, and then they have to, go on and figure out how to survive. And then there's a supposed mutiny. There's all kinds of intrigue. It's an incredibly great story, incredibly well told, incredibly pacey story of survival and of, humanity in its worst possible conditions. And all those kinds of things are a part of it. And I just thought it was a really propulsive, intriguing, great book, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. Number 2 on my list, and this book probably won't be a surprise, it's Men We Reap by Jesmyn Ward, her memoir of growing up in rural Mississippi in a small town, and the death of many men, young men that she knew, members of her family, cousins, brothers, friends of hers, friends of her cousins and brothers in this small town, and the impact that had on her. this is really brilliant because at no point does Ward pull punches. She lets us know what these young men were up to, which got them into trouble and oftentimes led to their death when that was true. But the overall, idea she creates is that these are young men living in a situation in which there are very little opportunities and there are very little occasion for hope, and everything seen in the system seems to be working against them, and that brings about these tragedies as well. And it's just incredibly powerful, emotional, personal stories about these young men and about their deaths and about their ways in which their deaths affected Ward. At the same time, a portrait of small rural Southern community and the importance and strength of family and of Black women in those families. And the last book on my list, number one on my list of top nonfiction books of 2023, is The Hemingses of Monticello, which was my top book at the halfway point too. This is a book by the historian Annette Reid, and this book tells the story of Sally Hemings and her family before and her family after, and the children that she had with Thomas Jefferson, because she was one of Thomas Jefferson's slaves. In fact, the Hemings family had been a part of the property that the Jefferson family counted on from before Thomas Jefferson and after Thomas Jefferson. They had owned these people. And this is an incredibly researched story. The research done here is impressive, and that's too light a word. It's just incredible research into a subject in which there isn't a lot of actual physical records or written records, and so Reid has to do what historians do all the time, which is to find crumbs and piece together a story and thread the whole thing together to create a cohesive narrative around what we can believe, we have evidence to support, believe happened, and what was going on with the Hemingses. And at the same time, she's able to create in the reader some of the tension that Sally Hemings must have felt about being essentially the sexual partner of Thomas Jefferson, even though they weren't married, even though she could never be accepted, and what it would mean to have kids who were enslaved in that system, and maybe why she did that, and what she hoped to gain from it. Just a really, really great book. Not a short book, but a great book and an impressive work of scholarship. Anyway, there you go. There is my top 10 nonfiction books that I read in 2023. Look forward to your comments in the comment section below. And as always, thank you for watching.